When the snow began to fall, no one expected it to last more than a few days. But for Samuel Fisher, a seasoned farmer from Lancaster County, the storm was only the beginning of a battle he knew too well. His barn, built not just for livestock, but for survival, would soon become the last refuge in the worst blizzard the region had seen in decades. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of ingenuity and faith in the face of nature's fury speak to your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. The wind howled through the valleys of Lancaster County long before the first snowflakes fell, as if the land itself was bracing for something it could not yet name. Samuel Fisher stood by his window, his eyes narrowing as the clouds rolled in from the west, heavy with the promise of snow. A seasoned farmer, he had seen winter's fury countless times. But something in the air told him this was no ordinary storm. It was late November, and the fields that once flourished with golden wheat and vibrant corn had long since been put to bed for the season. The barns were packed with hay, and the root cellars were full of winter's harvest, but Samuel wasn't concerned with the ordinary chores of the season. His mind, as always, was on his barn. His barn, the pride of his work, the embodiment of years of careful planning and stubborn determination, was more than just a shelter for his horses and cows. Samuel had designed it with the coming storms in mind, and this would be the first real test. Most barns in Lancaster were simple, straightforward affairs. Wooden structures with haylofts above and open spaces below, nothing more than a place to keep the animals fed and safe. But Samuel's barn was different. The walls were thick, built with interlocking timber designed to keep the bitter cold of winter at bay. Inside, there was more than enough room for his livestock, but the layout was far from traditional. Samuel had built a special, insulated chamber in the corner, a space that was meant for something more than animals. It was a space that would hold warmth. As the snow began to fall, soft at first but quickly turning into a driving storm, Samuel stepped into his boots, pulling his coat tightly around his shoulders. He knew he needed to prepare not just for the storm, but for what might come next. He had been raised to respect the land and its power, and when nature decided to challenge the world around him, Samuel always knew to be ready. Outside, the wind picked up, whipping snow into sharp flurries. Samuel moved with practiced efficiency, checking the gates, securing the last of his supplies. His gaze shifted to the horizon, and for a brief moment he wondered whether his carefully laid plans would be enough. But as the storm deepened, he knew there was little time for doubt. He headed for the barn, ready to prepare the shelter that might become the refuge for more than just his livestock. By morning, landscape had vanished beneath a thick blanket of snow, the earth itself erased from view. The fierce winds had transformed Lancaster County into a wild expanse of white, where everything familiar had become unfamiliar, even dangerous. What was meant to be a quiet winter storm had turned into a monster, one that would claim the lives of those who were unprepared. Samuel stepped out of the barn, the snow clinging to his coat like powdered sugar. He gazed out over the fields, his breath coming in quick puffs of vapor. It wasn't just the snow that made the storm dangerous, it was the cold. The wind was biting and relentless, digging into his skin. But he'd seen worse. In Norway, where he had come from, winters were longer, colder, and far more punishing. That knowledge, that quiet strength, was something Samuel carried with him every winter. Inside his barn, the fire crackled softly in the stove. The heat radiated out, warming the space despite the raging storm outside. His animals were already huddled together in the farthest corner of the barn, beneath the carefully designed insulation. Samuel had been told many times by his neighbors that he was wasting his time building such an elaborate structure. "A simple barn will do just fine, Samuel," they'd said. "A little hay, some wood for the stove, and you'll make it through." But Samuel's mind had never been swayed by the simple advice of others. He had a vision, and that vision was becoming clearer now. The wind howled like a wild animal outside, rattling the doors and windows of the barn, but inside it was different. There was a calmness to the space, a warmth that contrasted sharply with the world outside. Samuel stepped back into the center of the barn, taking in the sight of his animals, his work, and the space he had built not just for survival, but for a kind of peace that few could understand. He paused, feeling the weight of the storm press against the barn walls. The storm was only just beginning. He had no idea how long it would last or how severe it would become, but the animals were safe, and he was prepared. There was nothing more he could do but wait. And so, Samuel sat in the barn for hours, listening to the wind scream against the structure, watching the snow fall in steady sheets. The barn, his haven of warmth, had become his fortress. He thought of his neighbors, some of whom would struggle against the cold in their less prepared homes. Would they make it through the storm? Would they see the spring? The storm outside was unforgiving, but Samuel Fisher's barn was more than just a shelter. It was a testament to what could be built when a man dared to think beyond the ordinary, to build for the worst rather than just hope for the best. Little did he know that by the end of this blizzard, his barn would be the only place of refuge for those who had mocked his careful planning. By the third day of the blizzard, it became clear that this was no ordinary storm. The wind hadn't let up for a moment, and the snow continued to fall relentlessly, each flake a sharp reminder of nature's power. Samuel Fisher remained inside his barn, his mind heavy with thoughts of the others in the community. He had prepared for this kind of weather, but the severity of the storm worried him. He knew the dangers for those unprepared, for those who had chosen the quick and easy path over true resilience. The storm raged outside, yet within the barn, the air was still warm, thanks to the carefully designed insulation that Samuel had worked so hard to perfect. The fire burned steadily in the stove, its heat radiating outward, a beacon of comfort and safety. Samuel looked over his animals, his trusted companions during the long winter months. The cows huddled together in the corner, and the horses stamped their feet to keep warm, their breath hanging thick in the air. The barn was alive with the sounds of life, the crackling of the fire, the shifting of the animals, the soft fall of snow outside. But Samuel's mind remained restless. He had heard rumors of other farms, neighboring homes where the wind had already torn through the walls, where roofs had caved under the weight of the snow. He thought of his neighbor, William Crawford, who had mocked him for building such an elaborate barn. He had heard the laughter in Crawford's voice just a few months before, when Samuel explained why he was taking the extra time and effort to reinforce his barn. "You'll see," Samuel had said with quiet certainty. "Winter isn't always kind, and you'll need more than just good intentions to survive," Crawford had scoffed. Now, as the wind screamed outside, Samuel wondered whether Crawford's cabin had stood up to the storm or if his family was already struggling to survive. Samuel wasn't one for selfish pride, but the thought of his preparations saving not just his own life but the lives of his animals was a comfort amidst the uncertainty. And yet, the storm was far from over. As the hours passed, the storm intensified, and the stillness of the barn was interrupted by the sound of a horse's hooves approaching through the snow. Samuel's heart skipped a beat. Who would be traveling in this weather? He went to the door and peeked through the small window. A figure was trudging through the deep snow, barely visible through the whirling white. Samuel stepped out onto the porch, his boots crunching on the snow. "Is someone out there?" Samuel shouted into the wind. The figure, now closer, raised a hand, but the wind carried the voice away. Samuel opened the door wider, squinting into the blinding snow. The figure grew closer, a shadow within the storm, and then Samuel saw it. It was William Crawford, his face frozen and covered with frost. "Help! Help me, Samuel," Crawford gasped, stumbling through the snow, his feet dragging. "We can't survive. My house. It's gone. I need shelter." Samuel didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, catching Crawford just as he collapsed into his arms. The other man was too exhausted to speak, his lips trembling as they froze in the cold. "Come in. Come inside," Samuel said softly, pulling him toward the barn. "You're safe now." Inside the barn, the warmth immediately hit William Crawford, and his frozen body seemed to thaw with the first few breaths. Samuel helped him to a seat by the stove, wrapping him in a blanket and offering him a bowl of warm broth. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows on the walls, and the storm outside raged without mercy. But within the barn, there was peace. Crawford sat in stunned silence, looking around the barn that Samuel had so carefully constructed. He had seen it in passing, of course, but never truly noticed the careful design, the attention to detail that was now saving his life. The double walls, the thick insulation, the stable warmth, it was everything Samuel had promised. "Did you think I was foolish?" Samuel asked quietly, sitting across from him. His voice was calm, as though the storm outside was no more than a soft spring rain. Crawford, still shaking from the cold, shook his head slowly. His eyes flickered to the fire, and then back to Samuel. "I did. I thought you were over-prepared. A fool, really. But this storm, it's not like anything I've ever seen. I thought we could make it through, but now I know." Samuel nodded, understanding. He had known from the start that not everyone would understand the effort he put into his barn. He'd seen the eyes roll and heard the mocking words from his neighbors, but he didn't build for them. He built for what might come, for the worst-case scenario that too many people were unwilling to face. "I saw it when I left," Crawford continued, his voice growing weak with exhaustion. "My cabin, the roof. It just couldn't hold up. The wind tore through everything. My wife, she's not strong. She couldn't survive out there. I tried to get to the town, but the snow was too deep. I thought I'd lost them." Samuel reached over and placed a hand on Crawford's shoulder, a silent gesture of understanding. "You're safe here," he said simply. "You and your family will stay until the storm passes. We'll make sure you have what you need." The warmth of the barn, the steady fire, and the peace of Samuel's words began to calm Crawford. He looked up at Samuel, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and shame. "I've made mistakes, Samuel. I never thought to build for this, not like you did. I thought the winters would be like all the others, but this is different. It's the worst I've seen." Samuel stood up, glancing out the window where the storm still lashed against the barn. He wasn't worried about the storm anymore. He had built a safe haven, a place of warmth that would not only protect his animals, but anyone who needed it. This was the legacy of his hard work, not just for himself, but for the community. "You're not the only one who will need help," Samuel said, looking out at the snow. "Others will come. The storm's far from over." Crawford nodded in silence. He understood now. They would survive this winter together, in the warmth of the barn Samuel had built, as the storm howled outside. As the days stretched on, the blizzard showed no sign of relenting. The snow had piled high against the barn doors, and the howling wind had taken on a rhythm of its own, like a beast clawing at the edges of the world. Inside the barn, however, there was a stark contrast. The warmth from the fire and the careful layout of the building kept the interior snug, the walls trapping the heat Samuel had worked so hard to maintain. His barn, once a humble structure meant only to shelter his livestock, had now become a beacon of safety, the only refuge in the entire region. By the fourth day of the storm, more travelers had found their way to Samuel's barn. One by one, they trudged through the deep snow, seeking warmth and protection. Samuel had opened the doors wide, greeting each person with a quiet humility. Each face that appeared in the doorway told a story of desperation, of those who had failed to prepare for the severity of the storm, of those who had tried to ride out the weather in their small, insufficient cabins. One evening, as the storm howled louder than ever, Samuel was startled by a familiar voice calling through the wind. "Samuel! Samuel Fisher! Is that you?" He turned to see a figure emerging from the swirling snow, the dark shape barely visible through the curtain of wind and snowflakes. It was Jonas Miller, a farmer from the far side of the county, his family in tow. The sight of Jonas, bent low under the weight of the storm, brought a flood of concern to Samuel's chest. "Jonas, what on earth are you doing out in this?" Samuel rushed to the door, pulling it wide as Jonas stumbled forward, his breath short and his face pale. "The roads are impassable, Samuel!" Jonas gasped, his body shaking with the cold. "The children, they're at home. We couldn't get out. I thought we might freeze before we could reach the town." Samuel didn't waste a moment. "Bring them in," he said, guiding Jonas inside with a firm hand. The barn was already crowded, but there was always room for one more. The Miller family, a wife, a son, and 2 daughters, followed Jonas into the warmth, their faces reddened from the bitter wind. They all sat by the fire, exhausted, shivering, and thankful for the warmth. Jonas, looking around, finally let out a breath. "I never thought it would come to this, Samuel. Your barn. It's like a fortress." Samuel nodded. "I built it for this. I've been telling everyone that the winters here can be brutal, but no one listened. Jonas hung his head. "I know. I was one of those who thought you were overdoing it, wasting time and money. But now I see it. You've saved us, Samuel." Samuel didn't answer right away. He simply stoked the fire and kept his thoughts to himself. There was no need to boast, no need to say, "I told you so." The storm outside would decide everything soon enough. What mattered now was survival, and survival meant helping one another. As the 6th day of the blizzard dawned, the wind began to subside. The storm that had held the land in its icy grip was finally showing signs of exhaustion. The snow, once relentless, had turned from a wild fury to a soft, drifting blanket. For the first time in days, the light of the sun broke through the clouds, casting a pale, golden light over the frozen landscape. Samuel stood at the door of the barn, his boots crunching in the snow as he stepped outside. The storm had done its damage. The land was buried under a thick, unyielding layer of snow, and the air was sharp with the promise of even colder nights ahead. But the worst of it was over. Inside the barn, the fires had burned low. Samuel's visitors had found warmth, and the once quiet space was now filled with hushed conversations, laughter, and the sounds of survival. A sense of calm had settled over the group. They had made it through. Jonas Miller, sitting by the fire with his children, looked up at Samuel. "How long do you think we'll be stuck here?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. Samuel paused before answering, scanning the snow-covered fields outside. "A few more days, maybe. The railroad's still blocked, and the roads are too deep, but we'll make it. We have enough firewood, enough supplies to last until the storm passes completely." "Then what?" Jonas asked, his brow furrowing with concern. "Then we rebuild," Samuel said, his voice steady. "We'll get back to work. This storm may have changed everything, but we're alive. And we'll help those who need it. We'll make sure no one is left behind." There was a quiet understanding between them. The storm had tested them all, but the real test would come when the skies cleared. Samuel had never been one to look for praise or recognition, but there was no denying that his foresight had kept them safe. And now, as the storm passed, it was time to do what they did best: rebuild, start over, and help one another. Later that day, as the sun dipped behind the western hills, the last of Samuel's neighbors arrived, their faces tired but grateful. Samuel's barn had become a sanctuary, a place where faith, hard work, and community had made the difference between life and death. Those who had doubted him were now silent, their mockery replaced with gratitude. Jonas Miller, standing beside Samuel, watched the last of the survivors shuffle inside the barn, where they would be safe until the storm's aftermath had passed. "You were right all along, Samuel. This barn, this structure, this strength, it saved us." Samuel nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "It wasn't the barn that saved you. It was the people inside it, willing to help each other when it mattered most." As the fire crackled in the hearth and the barn settled into a new quiet, Samuel looked out at the snow-covered fields. The storm had taken its toll, but it had also brought them together in a way they never expected. The blizzard of '96 would go down in history as one of the worst the region had ever seen, but for Samuel Fisher and his neighbors, it was a lesson in survival, in humility, and in the quiet strength that carried them through. And when the spring thaw came, they would rebuild once more not just the barns, but the bonds between them all, stronger than any storm. The days that followed the storm were a blur of exhaustion and relief. As the snow finally stopped falling and the winds died down, the first light of morning revealed a world forever changed. Lancaster County, once a land of familiar fields and rolling hills, had become a desolate white expanse, stretching on endlessly under the heavy blanket of snow. For Samuel Fisher, the weight of the blizzard's impact began to settle. He stepped out of his barn, his boots crunching through the fresh snow, and looked around. The world outside was eerily quiet, save for the distant call of a bird or the soft rustling of snow in the trees. The storm had come and gone, leaving its mark on the land and on the hearts of those who had survived it. One by one, the neighbors who had sought refuge in his barn began to stir. They were weary but safe, and the fire in the stove was a welcome warmth. Samuel had made sure everyone had food, blankets, and the strength to recover from their ordeal. But now, the work of rebuilding both the land and their lives would begin. Jonas Miller, who had stayed with Samuel through the worst of the storm, came to him early that morning, his face drawn with the fatigue of several sleepless nights. "Samuel," he said, his voice soft but urgent, "we need to check on the others. Some of the cabins in the area, they might be buried under the snow. There are people out there who need help." Samuel nodded solemnly. "I know. We'll gather a group. We'll go out together. We're not going to leave anyone behind." The barn, which had been a shelter for so many during the storm, was now a place of action. Samuel organized the group, instructing them to take what they could carry: extra blankets, food, and a few tools. He knew the task ahead wouldn't be easy. The snow was deep, and the temperature would drop again by nightfall. But they had no choice. There were lives to save. Jonas turned to him. "What if some of the cabins didn't make it? What if we can't get to them in time?" Samuel's gaze was steady, unwavering. "We'll do what we can. It's not the storm that will define us, Jonas. It's what we do after. We'll help each other. We've made it this far, and together we'll make it the rest of the way." With those words, the group set off, their boots sinking into the deep snow as they made their way toward the scattered homesteads. Samuel led the way, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had weathered storms before, both literal and metaphorical. He didn't know what they would find, but he knew the community would rise to the challenge, just as it always had. The first cabin they reached was abandoned, its roof collapsed under the weight of the snow. The family who had lived there was nowhere to be found. The next house, however, had signs of life. Smoke rose from the chimney, and Samuel could hear the faint sounds of voices within. He smiled. "Looks like we're not too late," he said, relieved. The group moved forward, knocking gently on the door. Inside, the family was safe, huddled together near a fire. The father, a man named Peter Harden, looked up as the door opened. "Samuel, you've come," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "We didn't know how we'd make it without help." Samuel nodded, stepping inside to warm himself. "We're all in this together, Peter. No one's alone, not in this community." The group worked throughout the day, visiting the nearby homes, digging out driveways, shoveling roofs, and ensuring that everyone had enough food and shelter. As evening fell and the last of the snow was cleared, Samuel felt a quiet sense of accomplishment settle over him. The storm had taken much, but it hadn't taken everything. The strength of the community, the bonds of friendship, and the simple act of caring for one another had made all the difference. Weeks passed, and the world outside Samuel Fisher's barn slowly began to thaw. The snow melted in soft, gentle streams, the earth beneath beginning to breathe again as the chill of winter finally receded. Yet the memories of the storm remained fresh, as did the lessons it had taught. The blizzard of 1896 had come unexpectedly, without warning, and had tested every assumption about what it meant to live on the frontier. It had tested the strength of homes and the will of people, but more than anything, it had tested the very essence of community. The bonds that had been formed in the heat of the storm were now the foundation for a stronger, more connected future. Samuel knew that many of his neighbors had lost much. There had been cabins destroyed, crops buried, and families scattered. But there had also been a quiet resilience, a strength that could not be broken by the wind or the snow. They had survived together, and now it was time to rebuild not just their homes, but their lives. One evening, as Samuel stood outside his barn, looking at the freshly tilled fields and the patchwork of snow and mud that covered the ground, he felt a sense of peace. The land was beginning to heal, and so were the people. He knew the work ahead would be hard. It always was, after a storm like this. But there was something different this time. The storm had changed them, had brought them together in ways that nothing else could. Jonas Miller approached, his face tired but full of hope. "Samuel," he said, his voice strong, "I've been thinking. We've all been thinking. You were right. We can't live on this land alone. We need each other. We need to work together, build together, and look after one another. The storm showed us that." Samuel nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm glad to hear you say that. We've always been a community. Now, we'll rebuild not just the land, but the spirit of this place. we'll make it stronger than before." Jonas extended his hand. "You've already done it, Samuel. You built something that saved us all. That barn, it wasn't just a place for animals. It was a place of refuge, a place where we came together. And it's a place that will be remembered." Samuel took his hand, firm and steady. "We all did it together. That's what matters." And with that, the community moved forward. The barn would stand as a symbol, not just of survival, but of the spirit of Lancaster County, a spirit forged in the fire of hardship and tempered by the warmth of caring for one another. The future, though uncertain, would always be met with the knowledge that as long as they stood together, they could face any storm and come through it stronger than before. Spring came slowly to Lancaster County, creeping through the cracks of winter's hold like a timid guest. The earth, once blanketed in snow, began to show signs of life once more. Small green shoots pushed through the still chilly soil, and the trees, bare for so long, began to hint at new leaves. Yet, even as the warmth returned to the land, Samuel Fisher couldn't help but reflect on what the storm had taught him and the lessons it had left behind. Life had been returning to normal in the village, but the barn stood as a constant reminder of the storm's lasting impact. It had saved more lives than Samuel could count, and it had brought people together in ways that still resonated in the hearts of everyone who had sought refuge there. Each morning, Samuel worked diligently on his land, plowing the fields and tending to the animals. But there was something different now in the rhythm of his work. It wasn't just the land that needed tending. It was the people, too. Samuel had always believed in hard work, but now he believed even more in community, in looking after one another, and in seeing the quiet strength that emerged when people joined together in times of need. He spent more time with his neighbors, making sure their homes were rebuilt, their crops replanted, and their spirits lifted. They shared meals, worked side by side, and found comfort in the simple act of being together. As they rebuilt their homes, they rebuilt their faith in each other. The bond forged during the storm had become a permanent fixture in the village. Jonas Miller was one of the first to rebuild his cabin, a sturdy structure that now stood a little taller and stronger than before. "I thought I could do it alone, Samuel," Jonas said one afternoon as they sat on the porch of his new home, the smell of fresh bread rising from the kitchen. "But after the storm, I learned that strength doesn't come from standing alone. It comes from standing together." Samuel smiled and nodded, knowing that this was the true lesson of the blizzard. "That's right. Alone, we might have survived. But together, we thrive." As the sun set, casting a soft golden glow over the village, Samuel stood at the edge of his field, watching his neighbors work. There was no grandeur in the scene, no grand celebration, just the quiet, steady progress of people building their lives side by side, and that was enough. By the time summer arrived, the community of Lancaster County had found its new rhythm. The storm that had once torn the land apart had now become a memory, but a memory that would shape the future. Samuel Fisher's barn stood strong, its timber still solid, the warmth it had offered to so many still a part of its very essence. It was no longer just a barn, it was a symbol of what had been survived and what had been built in the aftermath. The people in the village had learned not just about the strength of the land, but about the strength within each other. The relationships forged in the warmth of that barn continued to grow, and the kindness that had flowed in the wake of the storm became a way of life. Samuel had been a quiet witness to this transformation, not seeking praise, but content in knowing that the efforts he had made to build not just a barn, but a sanctuary had mattered. One day, Samuel stood inside the barn, looking at the beams and the walls, still sturdy after all the hardships they had faced. The barn was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone who had sought shelter there, to everyone who had worked beside him to rebuild the land and their lives. Jonas Miller came by with his wife and children, carrying baskets of fruit from their newly planted orchard. "Samuel, we wanted to bring something to say thank you," he said, offering the basket. "You saved us, and this barn. It's become more than just a place for animals. It's a reminder of what can happen when we all stand together." Samuel took the basket with a smile, his heart warmed by the gesture. "Thank you, Jonas, but you've done the hard work. We all have." As the years passed, the barn continued to stand as a testament to what had been achieved, both in the fields and in the hearts of the people. And Samuel Fisher, who had built not just a barn but a legacy of community, knew that the real value of the barn wasn't in the timber or the walls. It was in the connections that had been forged there. Connections that would last long after the snow had melted and the blizzards had passed. The barn became a gathering place, a center of community life. It hosted harvest festivals, communal meals, and weddings, and it was always a place of refuge for anyone who needed it. Its legacy lived on in the generations that followed, as the lessons of faith, resilience, and unity continued to shape the lives of those who had been touched by the storm. And so, in the quiet of the Lancaster evenings, Samuel Fisher would stand at the edge of his field, watching his community thrive. The storm had come and gone, but what it had left behind was something far more enduring: the spirit of a community that would face any storm together.